The date is October 2023, somewhere in a tree line north of Lyman, Donetsk Oblast. A Ukrainian observer, call sign Sokil, lies flat against the forest floor. Pine needles, mud, the smell of cordite drifting from somewhere to the east. He has been in this position for 4 hours. His radio is on the lowest possible volume. Through his optics, he watches a Russian infantry column picking its way along a firebreak road, maybe 400 meters out. He counts. 12 soldiers on foot, 2 BTR-82A armored personnel carriers, a small truck towing what looks like a 120mm mortar system. He doesn't move. He keys his radio, 1 short transmission, a grid reference, a vehicle count, a direction of movement. Then silence. 40 seconds later, the forest north of the column erupts. 2 155mm artillery rounds land in sequence, 20 meters apart, bracketing the road. The BTRs lurch. The column scatters into the trees. The mortar truck stops dead. Sokil waits. He has done this before. Not once, not twice. For 8 months, this sector of the Eastern Front has run on exactly this rhythm. Patience, observation, precision, and deliberate violence at a time and place of Ukrainian choosing. This is the story of the 25th Separate Airborne Assault Brigade. What they built in the forests north of Lyman was not simply a defensive line. It was a machine. Here's what most coverage of the Lyman sector misses. The 25th Brigade didn't hold this ground by fighting Russia on Russia's terms. They didn't meet assault after assault in static trenches, bleeding manpower against an enemy willing to spend soldiers like currency. They did something more deliberate. They turned 80 square kilometers of mixed forest, ravine, and river bottomland into a killing architecture, a landscape where every Russian tactical choice led somewhere Ukrainian fires were already waiting. What you're about to see is what elastic, depth-based defense actually looks like when it's executed by a unit that understood its terrain better than the force attacking it. It's a doctrine story as much as a battle story. The evidence, geolocated footage, mapped assault axes, unit-level reporting from verified Ukrainian sources, tells a story that frontline casualty numbers alone can't convey. By the time the 25th Brigade rotated out of this sector, Russian assault formations attacking the northern Lyman approaches had lost, according to open-source tracking by Oryx and corroborating Ukrainian General Staff reporting, more than 60 armored vehicles in this sector alone. Multiple Russian battalion tactical groups had been rendered combat ineffective without ever achieving a meaningful breakthrough. The forest held. The question is how. To understand what the 25th Brigade was up against, you need to understand what Lyman means on the map, and why both sides treated this ground as worth fighting over with such persistence. Lyman sits in northeastern Donetsk Oblast, roughly 40 kilometers northwest of the city of Kreminna. It's a rail junction town, one of the relatively few nodes in this part of eastern Ukraine where rail lines converge in a way that matters for logistics. In Soviet-era planning, Lyman, then called Krasny Lyman, was a secondary but real logistics hub. In the context of the 2022-2024 war, it became something more. A symbolic and operational anchor for the entire Lyman-Kreminna axis, a front line that stretched northeast through dense forest toward the Oskil River and the Luhansk Oblast boundary. Russia captured Lyman in late May 2022 during the same operational surge that overran Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and briefly seemed to threaten a collapse of the entire northern Donetsk front. At that point, Russian forces were still operating with reasonable coordination, still capable of multi-axis armored advances, still projecting the image of a conventional military on a conventional offensive. What happened next changed all of that. Ukraine's liberation of Lyman on October 1st, 2022, announced by Ukrainian General Staff as Russian forces were still encircling, was more than a tactical success. It was a signal. It demonstrated that Russia's hold on the territory it had seized in the summer of 2022 was not consolidated. It demonstrated that Ukrainian forces, operating with better ISR and increasingly confident in combined arms coordination, could retake ground even against dug-in defenders. But liberation of the town was not the end of the fight. It was the beginning of a different and harder one. Lyman, without its northern approaches, is exposed. The terrain directly north of the town, running toward the villages of Torske-Yampolivka, Nadia, and the broader Serebrianka forest massif, is a defender's nightmare on paper and a sophisticated unit's best friend in practice. The Serebrianka forest complex is one of the largest continuous woodland areas in Donetsk Oblast, a mixed pine and deciduous belt running roughly 30 kilometers north to south and varying between 8 and 15 kilometers wide. Beneath the canopy, the terrain is cut by ravines, seasonal stream beds, and the floodplain of the Zherebets River, which flows generally westward before joining the Siversky Donetsk system. For an attacker, specifically for Russian mechanized forces trying to push south toward Lyman and then west toward Sloviansk, this terrain is deeply punishing. Vehicles are channeled onto a small number of trafficable routes. Infantry off those routes moves slowly and is easily disoriented. Artillery observation from the ground is limited. Drone operations are complicated by canopy cover and the way tree lines break thermal signatures. For a defender who knew those routes, had mapped those ravines, and had established observation posts along every viable approach, it was a different proposition entirely. The 25th Separate Airborne Assault Brigade arrived in this sector in early 2023, following the grinding battles of late 2022. The brigade had been activated in the first months of the full-scale invasion, built around a cadre of professional airborne personnel, and expanded rapidly with volunteers. By the time it took responsibility for the northern Lyman approaches, it had already seen significant combat. What it brought to this sector, according to Ukrainian military journalists embedded with the unit and reporting from sources including Militarny and Defense Express, was not just personnel. It was a methodology. The brigade's command had studied the terrain before committing to a defensive scheme. What they concluded, and what would define the next 8 months, was that the forest could not be held by conventional linear defense. There were too many potential Russian approach routes. The frontage was too wide for the manpower available, and Russian forces, despite their tactical limitations, had demonstrated a willingness to absorb extraordinary casualties, probing Ukrainian lines until they found a gap. Linear defense in this environment would be ground down. Something else was required. What's most surprising about what the 25th Brigade built isn't the technology. It's how much of their effectiveness came from a conceptual decision made before the first shot was fired. They chose depth over line. They chose attrition over denial. And they chose to let the forest do the work that would otherwise cost soldiers. The defensive architecture that the 25th Brigade developed over the first weeks of their deployment had 3 interconnected layers. And understanding how they work together is the key to understanding why 8 months of Russian assault failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough on this axis. The first layer was the observation network. Forward posts, small teams, typically 2 to 4 personnel, positioned in prepared positions at intervals through the forward edge of the brigade's area of operations, functioned not as fighting positions, but as sensors. Their mission was not to hold ground or engage Russian infantry in direct fire. Their mission was to see, report, and survive. These posts were positioned with deliberate care. The selection criteria, as described by brigade personnel in interviews with Ukrainian military media, prioritized 3 things: fields of observation covering the primary Russian approach routes, covered withdrawal routes that allowed teams to pull back without being cut off, and concealment sufficient to survive Russian counter-battery and direct fire attempts once a position was compromised. The posts were rotated regularly. A team would hold a position for a defined period, then pull back and be replaced, degrading Russia's ability to pattern the observation network and call in strikes on fixed positions. The communications architecture supporting these posts was layered. Primary communication ran through encrypted digital systems. Backup was analog radio with brevity codes. When a team reported a contact, vehicle type, count, grid, direction of movement, speed, that report traveled to a fire coordination cell at brigade level within seconds. The coordination cell maintained a running picture of Russian activity across the entire sector, cross-referencing reports from multiple posts to distinguish genuine assault preparations from probes or feints. The second layer was the fire architecture. The brigade's organic artillery, a mix of 155mm howitzers, 152mm systems, and 120mm mortars, was positioned well back from the forward edge, dispersed across multiple firing positions and capable of rapid displacement. Ukraine's General Staff, reporting on the Lyman sector from mid-2023, noted the integration of HIMARS-provided deep fires with brigade organic artillery as a key element of the defensive scheme. Russian assembly areas and logistics nodes identified through the forward observation network could be struck before formations even reached the forward edge. More importantly, the fire systems were pre-registered. Every trafficable approach route, every firebreak road, every tracked vehicle crossing point on the Zherebets and its tributaries, every cleared area wide enough to concentrate vehicles, had pre-computed fire missions. When a forward observer reported a column moving along Axis 7 or crossing the ford at grid reference Lima Papa Niner, the artillery wasn't solving a new problem. They were executing a prepared solution. The integration of FPV drone teams added a third dimension to this layer. By mid-2023, the 25th Brigade had integrated dedicated FPV strike teams into its defensive scheme. These teams operated from positions behind the forward line, launching strikes against individual vehicles or dismounted infantry that survived the initial artillery response, or against targets that were too close to forward observation posts for artillery to engage safely. The cost asymmetry was stark. A $400–800 FPV drone against a $2–3 million BTR or BMP represented exactly the kind of exchange ratio that Ukrainian defense planners had identified as strategically decisive. Put yourself in the position of a Russian assault company commander on this axis in the summer of 2023. You have your orders. Advance along the Torske axis, push south, establish a foothold. You have your vehicles, your men, your fire support plan. But every route your vehicles can use has been pre-registered by Ukrainian artillery. Every open approach has Ukrainian drone coverage. And somewhere in the trees, people are watching you. Watching your vehicle count, your formation, the time you leave your staging area. You don't know where the Ukrainian line is, because there isn't a line in the way you've been trained to think about it. The third layer was the prepared fallback architecture. Rather than defending a single forward trace, the 25th Brigade had established a series of prepared positions running back through the depth of their sector. Fighting positions, vehicle hides, command nodes, and medical points distributed across multiple terrain features. If Russian pressure succeeded in pushing forward observation posts back, if a Russian assault managed to suppress or destroy a section of the forward defensive structure, Ukrainian forces had a prepared position to fall back to. The fallback was not a defeat. It was the next phase of the attrition machine. This is the doctrine shift this episode is really about. Modern Ukrainian defensive doctrine, demonstrated across multiple sectors, but most clearly in the forested terrain of the Lyman-Kreminna axis, had moved decisively away from the Soviet legacy linear defense model that Russian planners expected their opponents to employ. The expectation, baked into Russian operational planning, was that Ukrainian forces would hold a line, that sufficient pressure applied to that line would eventually break it, and that breakthrough would follow. What the 25th Brigade built instead was an elastic defense of depth. Ground could give, positions could be vacated. What could not give was the ability to observe, report, and strike. As long as that capability remained intact, every Russian tactical advance was entering a new killing zone, not escaping an old one. I spent time going through the documented engagement records from this sector. The geolocated footage, the Ukrainian military reporting, the mapped contacts. One detail kept standing out. The pattern of Russian vehicle losses in the Serebrianka sector was not random. The concentrations of destroyed equipment consistently appeared at specific choke points, road junctions, stream crossings, the edges of open fields where vehicles emerging from tree cover would have been momentarily exposed. These are exactly the locations you'd expect to find pre-registered fires. The Ukrainians weren't reacting to Russian advances. They were executing prepared plans against a force that kept approaching through the same terrain features. By late summer 2023, the pattern was becoming visible even in open-source data. The Lyman sector was not static. It was churning. Russian forces were attacking regularly with significant assets. They were not achieving breakthrough. They were taking losses. And the losses were clustering at specific locations that appeared again and again in geolocated footage. What wasn't visible yet, what would only become clear as the broader operational picture came into focus, was the pressure Russia was building further along the axis. Because while the 25th Brigade was grinding Russian assault formations north of Lyman, Russian command was simultaneously developing options to the northeast, toward Kreminna and the Oskil River line. The attrition on the Lyman axis was real, but it was happening against the backdrop of a Russian operational campaign that had more axes than any single brigade could cover. The question facing Ukrainian command in the autumn of 2023 was whether the elastic defense the 25th Brigade had built could hold not just against the pressure it had already absorbed, but against a Russian force that had started, slowly and expensively, to adapt. Here's the part that doesn't sit right when you look at the Russian tactical adjustments from this period. By September and October 2023, Russian assault formations attacking the northern Lyman approaches had begun to modify their approach in ways that suggested at least some degree of learning. Smaller groups, typically fire teams of 4 to 6 infantry rather than full platoon-strength elements, were used as the first echelon, probing Ukrainian positions and attempting to draw fire before the vehicle-mounted follow-on forces moved. The use of Russian FPV drones in counter-observation roles increased, with UAVs hunting Ukrainian forward posts before assaults. These adaptations were tactically logical. They were also, in the specific terrain of the Serebrianka forest, extremely difficult to execute effectively. Small infantry groups in dense forest are slow, noisy relative to their own expectations, and highly vulnerable to the same FPV drone systems the Ukrainians had deployed in depth. The counter-observation drone operations required significant manpower in UAV teams, which Russia was not deploying in sufficient density on this axis to be decisive. Most importantly, and this is the critical operational insight, these adaptations were trading tactical sophistication for operational tempo. The small group probing approach took longer to develop. It consumed more time between assault attempts. This reduced the rate at which Russian forces could actually generate pressure, which was the one variable that Ukrainian elastic defense could not handle indefinitely. Here's the take that some will push back on. Russian tactical adaptation on the Lyman axis in 2023 was significantly better than most Western commentary acknowledged. Russian units were not blindly attacking the same positions in the same way with the same results. But tactical adaptation without adequate ISR, without reliable drone coverage, without the kind of decentralized fire coordination that Ukrainian units had developed, is like adjusting your map reading technique while driving into a minefield. You can improve, but the fundamental problem, a defensive architecture specifically designed to defeat your approach, remains. The real Russian strategic failure on the Lyman-Kreminna axis was not tactical. It was the decision, made at a level well above the assault companies and battalion tactical groups doing the dying, to continue generating frontal pressure on a sector where that pressure was visibly not achieving results, rather than accepting the stalemate and concentrating assets on axes where Ukrainian defenses were less prepared. What do you think? Does that represent a failure of Russian operational intelligence, or a command structure that couldn't translate tactical-level feedback into operational decisions? That's a question worth sitting with, because the answer says something important about what kind of force Russia is now, after 3 years of this war. The quantified cost of the failed Russian effort on the northern Lyman axis during this period is instructive. Open-source tracking through Oryx, cross-referenced with geolocated footage and Ukrainian General Staff reporting, documents the destruction of more than 60 armored vehicles on the Torske-Yampolivka-Serebrianka axis between January and September 2023. This includes at minimum 14 tanks, primarily T-72B3 and T-80BVM variants, and more than 40 armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, predominantly BTR-82A and BMP-2 types. Multiple self-propelled artillery systems were also destroyed, including at least 3 2S-1 Gvozdika 122mm howitzers caught while attempting to establish firing positions too far forward. The personnel cost is harder to quantify from open sources, and the 25th Brigade has appropriately declined to provide numbers that would assist Russian force assessments. What can be said, from unit-level reporting and from the observable combat power of Russian formations on this axis over time, is that multiple Russian formations, assessed at battalion tactical group strength, cycled through this sector and were rendered combat ineffective without achieving their assigned objectives. Ukrainian sources, speaking to military journalists on background, described a pattern of Russian assault formations arriving, sustaining heavy losses over a period of weeks, and being withdrawn and replaced with reconstituted or fresh units, only for the cycle to begin again. This replacement pattern itself tells a story. A force that was achieving its objectives, or that had identified a viable path to achieving them, would not need to cycle through multiple successive formations on the same axis. The replacement cycle on the northern Lyman approaches reflects a Russian command that was unable or unwilling to either break through or redirect its efforts, and that continued feeding units into a sector where the Ukrainian defensive architecture had demonstrated its effectiveness. The 25th Brigade's own preservation of combat power across this period is equally significant. Ukrainian defensive doctrine in the elastic model is specifically designed to trade terrain, temporarily, controllably, for the preservation of force. A unit that holds every position at all costs, but loses a third of its strength doing so, is less combat effective at the end of the battle than a unit that gives 500 meters of forest, but retains 90% of its personnel and systems. The 25th Brigade's ability to continue operations across 8 months, maintaining coherent command and control, sustaining its observation network, and rotating its forward teams, speaks to a disciplined execution of exactly this principle. What strikes me about the 25th Brigade's operational record on this axis is what it reveals about the maturation of Ukrainian combined arms doctrine. In 2022, Ukrainian forces were improvising, adapting to a full-scale invasion with training and equipment that didn't match the scale of what they faced. By 2023, something different was happening. Units were developing and executing genuine doctrinal frameworks, building on experience and on Western training inputs, producing a style of defense specifically adapted to Ukrainian terrain, Ukrainian capabilities, and Russian tactical patterns. The Lyman Forest sector is one of the clearest examples of that maturation on the entire Eastern Front. The integration of HIMARS fires into the brigade-level defensive scheme deserves particular attention. According to Ukrainian General Staff reporting from the summer of 2023, HIMARS systems assigned to the Lyman axis were used not primarily for spectacular deep strikes, the mode of employment that dominated early coverage of the weapon, but for what military planners call shaping. Russian logistics nodes identified by the Forward Observation Network, assembly areas where replacement assault formations were staging, artillery positions attempting to support Russian advances. These were the priority targets. The goal was not to film a dramatic explosion. The goal was to degrade the Russian capacity to generate and sustain assault tempo, This is unglamorous work. It doesn't produce footage that drives social media engagement. But it's operationally decisive in a way that individual dramatic strikes are not. A Russian battalion tactical group that arrives at its staging area to find its ammunition vehicles destroyed and its artillery support degraded cannot maintain the assault tempo its orders require. The pipeline of Russian combat power flowing into the Lyman forest sector was being thinned before it arrived, through the systematic targeting enabled by the 25th Brigade's observation architecture. By the end of 2023, the northern Lyman axis had settled into what analysts at ISW and other open-source monitoring organizations were describing as a grinding attritional dynamic. Not a frozen front, but not a fluid one either. Russian forces were continuing to attack. The 25th Brigade and the forces it operated alongside were continuing to defend, bend, and attrite. The forest was neither fully Ukrainian nor fully Russian in the localized way that modern positional warfare works. A tree line here, a ravine there, positions that changed hands and then changed back. But the strategic objective, the defense of the northern approaches to Lyman, the prevention of a Russian breakthrough that would threaten the broader Ukrainian defensive architecture in Donetsk Oblast, was being met. Not cleanly, not without cost, but it was being met. The 25th Brigade's rotation out of the sector when it came was not a defeat. It was the natural consequence of a unit that had been in continuous high-intensity combat for the better part of a year. The relief in place, units rotating in to take over a sector the 25th had defended and developed, was an acknowledgement that the defensive architecture they had built was not personal to them. It was institutional. The observation posts, the pre-registered fires, the prepared fallback positions, the documented patterns of Russian approach, all of this was passed to the incoming unit. The machine kept running. There is a line in a Ukrainian military journalist's account of the 25th Brigade's time in the Lyman sector that has stayed with me. A brigade officer, speaking without attribution, described the defensive philosophy as not holding ground, but managing the cost of ground. That formulation captures something real. In the forest north of Lyman, the 25th Brigade made Russian ground exquisitely expensive, not by standing in front of Russian forces and dying in place, by making the ground itself hostile, by turning every ridge, every ravine, every firebreak road into a decision point where Russian forces had to choose between options that Ukrainian planners had already anticipated and addressed. This is what doctrine looks like when it's working. Not a plan, a system. Will Russia eventually adapt its approach to Ukrainian elastic forest defense in a way that degrades its effectiveness? Comment yes or no, because the answer matters for how the next phase of this front develops. What the Lyman sector demonstrates at the broader operational level is the degree to which the Russia-Ukraine war has become a laboratory for modern combined arms defensive doctrine. The principles the 25th Brigade applied, depth over line, attrition over denial, terrain integration, layered observation and fires, are not Ukrainian inventions. They come from the broader body of Western defensive doctrine, absorbed through years of training partnership and accelerated dramatically through the experience of full-scale war. But their application in the specific conditions of the Serebrianka forest, against a Russian force with specific tactical patterns and specific limitations, represents a genuine doctrinal development that militaries studying this war will be examining for decades. The cost to Russia of its northern Lyman campaign is worth restating in full. More than 60 armored vehicles destroyed or damaged on this axis alone. Multiple battalion tactical groups cycled through the sector and combat ineffective by the time they withdrew. No meaningful territorial advance after the initial Russian probing actions of early 2023. And, critically, no degradation of the Ukrainian defensive architecture sufficient to create conditions for the breakthrough Russian operational planning required. Against this, Russian forces achieved localized tactical successes at the small unit level. Positions taken, Ukrainian forward posts temporarily overrun, short advances along specific routes. In the context of a conventional military campaign, some of these would represent meaningful tactical gains. In the context of the elastic defensive system the 25th Brigade had built, they were the system working as designed. The forward edge could give ground. The attrition machine kept running. The Russian formations that fought on the northern Lyman axis in 2023 were not incompetent. Many of the units involved, including elements of the 20th Combined Arms Army and the 3rd Army Corps, the latter built around mobilized personnel, were operating in conditions of significant degradation. Incomplete training, equipment that mixed modern systems with Cold War-era vehicles, commanders working with communication systems that Ukrainian electronic warfare was consistently degrading. They were attempting conventional combined arms operations with forces that had lost the coherent combined arms capability that doctrine requires. Against a less prepared defender, some of their assault attempts might have succeeded. Against the 25th Brigade's integrated observation fire depth system in terrain that amplified every Ukrainian advantage and minimized every Russian one, they were attempting to solve a problem that their available tools could not solve. The open-source record of this is detailed enough that analysts can watch the pattern develop in near real time. Geolocated footage from the sector, cross-referenced against mapping of Russian assault axes, shows the same approach routes being used by successive Russian formations. The same forest roads, the same stream crossings, the same open fields at the southern edge of the Serebrianka complex. Either Russian command did not have accurate information about why previous attempts along these routes had failed, or it had that information and chose to repeat the approach anyway. Neither explanation is flattering. There's a broader question embedded in the Lyman Forest story, one that open-source analysts tracking the Eastern Front are watching closely now, in the months after this period. It is the question of what happens when the doctrinal advantage that units like the 25th Brigade established through careful preparation and terrain integration meets the grinding reality of extended war. Elastic defense works when units have the manpower, the observation capability, the fire support, and the command coherence to execute it. All of these are subject to attrition. Experienced forward observers who understand their sector can be replaced, but not instantly, and not without a loss of accumulated knowledge. Prepared positions can be rebuilt, but time and resources are finite. The Lyman axis in 2024 and into 2025 has continued to see Russian pressure. The defensive architecture the 25th Brigade developed has been maintained, but maintaining it against a Russian force that has increased its use of drone-enabled reconnaissance, that has improved its counter-battery tactics, and that has demonstrated willingness to accept extraordinary losses in generating assault tempo, is a different proposition than building it from scratch against a less capable attacker. What open-source analysts are watching on this axis, according to reporting from ISW and independent OSINT accounts tracking the Lyman-Kreminna sector, is whether Russian forces can find a way to systematically degrade the forward observation capability that is the keystone of Ukrainian elastic defense, rather than simply absorbing its effects. If Russian counter-UAV and counter-observation operations improve to the point where forward posts become unsustainable, the fire architecture they support loses its eyes. That is the attack surface that Russian operational planning on this axis has most clearly identified, even if tactical execution has remained inconsistent. The 25th Brigade's 8 months in the Lyman Forest sector will likely be studied alongside the better-known engagements of this war. The first HIMARS strikes on Russian logistics in June 2022, the liberation of Kherson, the Kursk incursion of August 2024, as a formative case study in what modern defensive warfare can achieve when doctrine, terrain, and unit competence align. It is less cinematic than a single dramatic strike. It is less legible in satellite imagery than the destruction of a command post. But in operational terms, what the 25th Brigade achieved was the preservation of a critical defensive axis for 8 months against sustained Russian assault, and the destruction of more than 60 Russian armored vehicles in the process. The forest north of Lyman is still contested. The Serebrianka front line still runs through mixed pine and scrub, still crosses the same ravines and stream beds where Russian assault formations learned, expensively, that the terrain was not neutral. The brigades operating there now operate in the shadow of what the 25th established, using the same principles, the same pre-registered fires, the same depth architecture. What we're watching for now, across this axis and in the broader Donetsk forest belt, is whether Ukrainian forces can sustain the quality of defensive preparation that made the Lyman sector so costly for Russia to attack. As the war extends, and the personnel who carried that knowledge in their heads cycle through rotation after rotation, the machine the 25th Brigade built was more than institutional. But institutional knowledge is precisely what erodes under pressure, and pressure on this axis is not easing. The Serebrianka forest is still absorbing Russian assault formations. The pre-ranged kill zones are still marked on Ukrainian artillery computers. The question, the one that this sector has been asking for over 2 years, is whether the defense can outlast the offense. What's your read on that? If you've been following this front, drop a comment, because the open-source community tracking this axis is genuinely divided on the trajectory. We read every one. The forest keeps its secrets, but the evidence says the 25th Airborne Brigade held. And in this war, on this ground, holding was everything.